I want to begin by saying something I don't usually state so directly, because the way this subject is framed demands a level of honesty that softer wording would only weaken. What I'm about to describe is not some comforting version of poetic justice, where harm is neatly repaid and balance is restored in a clean moral equation. Real life doesn't operate with that kind of symmetry. What I'm talking about is something far more complex and far more accurate. It is the inner psychological process that unfolds within a person, specifically someone with avoidant patterns, when they betray a partner whose depth, emotional integrity, and capacity to love were quietly central to their life, even if they never consciously admitted it, even if their actions suggested otherwise. And when I use the word betrayal, I'm not limiting it to obvious or dramatic ruptures that are easy to name. I'm also referring to the quieter forms that exist in avoidant dynamics, the moments where someone pulls away right when emotional closeness is needed most, the times when silence replaces presence, the pattern of being warm enough to create hope, then distant enough to slowly dismantle it, the act of receiving deep emotional investment while consistently failing to meet it with equal reciprocity. These are betrayals, even if the person committing them doesn't fully label them that way. That lack of awareness is not a side detail. It is part of the mechanism itself. Because while it may not register as betrayal in their own mind, it absolutely registers in the nervous system and emotional reality of the person on the receiving end. And from that point onward, something begins to unfold in the background that is slow, layered, and far more lasting than any immediate consequence would be. To understand this process, the first thing that has to be clear is why the avoidant often had no real awareness of the weight of what they were doing. That ignorance is not accidental. It is structural. It sits at the core of how avoidant attachment operates. The avoidant does not fully grasp what they are losing in the moment of loss, because their perception of connection itself is filtered. There is a built-in distortion that consistently minimizes the value of emotional closeness while it is available and exaggerates the sense that its absence will be manageable. It is not a conscious devaluation. It is a psychological adaptation that reshapes perception in real time. One of the deepest ironies here is that the same system designed to protect them from emotional overwhelm also prevents them from accurately registering emotional significance. The defenses that reduce pain also reduce clarity. So while they are inside something rare, meaningful, and deeply human, their internal system is quietly dampening the signal of its importance. What this creates in practice is a person making relational decisions without full access to the actual stakes. They withdraw, disconnect, or withhold without truly perceiving what is being placed in front of them. They assume on some level that what is there will remain accessible, that it can be returned to, that it can tolerate neglect without breaking. And because of that, they step away from things that are not replaceable, while being unable to fully comprehend that fact in the moment. The real consequence does not begin at the moment of betrayal. It begins later. Timing is everything here because what unfolds is not immediate punishment, but delayed recognition. In the early phase after withdrawal or separation, the avoidant system is still fully engaged in defense. It reorganizes experience to keep emotional disruption contained. It suppresses, rationalizes, distances, and rewrites meaning in a way that preserves internal stability. From the outside, this often looks like indifference. It can appear as if nothing significant was lost, as if the connection carried no real emotional weight. And that is what makes it so painful for the person who was left behind. They interpret that surface-level calm as proof that they never mattered. But that interpretation misses what is actually happening underneath. It is not absence of feeling. It is the active containment of it. A psychological system working continuously to prevent full emotional impact from breaking through. What looks like composure is often just control under pressure, a stabilization strategy, not a conclusion. The real reckoning arrives later when those defenses begin to weaken. And when they do, what surfaces is not sudden drama, but delayed clarity. the gradual realization of what was present, what was dismissed, and what cannot be replaced. It is the moment when the avoidant comes face to face with something they can no longer reinterpret, reframe, or quietly push aside, the undeniable reality of what has been lost. Sometimes that reality is nothing more complicated than your absence itself. Not the fresh sting of a recent ending, but the settled, irreversible absence of someone who has truly moved forward. Someone who has taken the energy once directed toward the avoidant and redirected it inward, into a life that is whole, self-contained, and no longer oriented around waiting. A life that carries no emotional gap reserved for their return. That is often the first real disruption, because up until that point, the avoidance system has been operating on an unspoken assumption that access to you still exists in some form, that the connection, however damaged, still has an open ending. When they encounter proof that this is no longer true, that the chapter is not paused, but closed, something internal begins to destabilize. At other times, the trigger is more direct. They encounter you in a context where the change is impossible to miss. You are no longer the version of yourself they held in memory or quietly reduced to something manageable. You are more grounded, more self-contained, more fully aligned with yourself in a way that does not ask for approval or permission. And that shift does not pass through their usual emotional filters. It lands too cleanly for distortion to fully contain it. Either way, once that evidence is registered, the internal reckoning begins, and it is important not to romanticize this process or reduce it into something simplistic. The reality is more precise and far more layered. The first stage is cognitive. There is a sudden increase in clarity, an unwelcome accuracy in how they begin to perceive the past. The mind starts to revisit what was previously minimized or blurred. The emotional significance of what they had access to becomes harder to avoid intellectually. What was once buffered by distance or justification starts to appear in sharper definition. You are no longer the softened, simplified version they were able to hold on to while pulling away. Instead, memory begins to reconstruct you with more fidelity. Your depth, your emotional intelligence, your consistency in care, your capacity to stay present in moments where it would have been easier to withdraw, all of it begins to surface in awareness with a kind of precision that was not available before. And alongside that clarity comes something heavier, the recognition of participation. Not in an abstract or theoretical sense, but in a direct, unavoidable way. They begin to see the exact moments where they chose distance over presence, avoidance over honesty, withdrawal over engagement. The pattern that once felt manageable now appears cumulative, not as isolated decisions, but as a continuous sequence that shaped the outcome. There is also a more uncomfortable realization that follows this, that you did not respond to their inconsistency with the same inconsistency. You stayed emotionally generous longer than their behavior justified. You continued to meet them with understanding in places where they were not offering the same in return. And that imbalance, once fully visible, carries a psychological weight that is difficult to neutralize. This is where emotional consequence becomes most pronounced internally, not in external collapse, but in self-recognition. The avoidant begins to see not only what was lost, but what they contributed to losing it. And that level of awareness does not arrive gently. It tends to come in waves, often interrupting the very defenses that once kept it out. Now, it is important to be clear about what ruined their life actually means in this context, because it is not about dramatic external downfall or visible punishment. It is not a story of immediate collapse or obvious consequence. What is being described is more internal than that. What is disrupted is access to a particular emotional version of themselves that only existed in the context of being seen, challenged, and emotionally met in the way your presence allowed. That version was not independent of the relationship. It was activated through it. And over time, through repeated withdrawal and disconnection, the conditions that supported that version were eroded. What remains is not necessarily destruction, but limitation. A narrower emotional range, a quieter internal world, a return to self-sufficiency that once felt like strength, but in hindsight carries a different emotional texture, something closer to containment than freedom. And in the moments of honesty that follow, that contrast becomes difficult to ignore. The independence that the avoidant ego was built around, the pride in needing no one, requiring nothing, moving through life untouched by dependency or emotional exposure, doesn't disappear after such a loss. It changes form. It becomes quieter, less absolute, and in its place, something more complicated begins to surface. An awareness of what real emotional need actually felt like when it was met with warmth, consistency, and sincerity. That awareness doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't disrupt their life in an obvious way, but it also doesn't fully leave. It settles into the background of their internal world and begins to color experience in subtle but persistent ways. It shows up in moments they don't fully acknowledge, in relationships that never quite reach that earlier depth, in evenings that feel slightly unfinished without any clear reason, in brief flashes of reflection that are quickly redirected before they turn into something emotionally demanding. And this is important to understand. The impact of what happened is not limited to what was lost externally. It extends into what was altered internally. There is a principle in psychology that applies strongly here. People are shaped in lasting ways by the decisions they make in emotionally significant moments, not in a rigid or irreversible sense. Change is always possible, but in a cumulative sense. Each time someone chooses protection over openness, distance over presence, avoidance over engagement, that choice strengthens the pathway toward repetition. The defended response becomes easier to access next time. The open response becomes slightly harder to reach. Over time, these repeated choices don't just affect behavior, they shape identity. They reinforce the structure of the self that makes those choices feel natural. So when an avoidant repeatedly withdraws at moments that required emotional courage, it doesn't just end a connection. It gradually reinforces the internal architecture that made withdrawal feel like the safer option. And at the same time, it widens the distance between who they are in their defended state and who they might have been in a more open, integrated one. What remains is a life that can still function, sometimes even impressively so from the outside. Avoidant systems are often highly capable in practical terms, but beneath that functionality is an awareness that doesn't fully integrate. The knowledge of what was possible, what was offered, and what was not met with the level of care it required. And it is here that I want to slow this down and be careful with what it means for you. There is a natural pull in narratives like this toward emotional resolution through reversal, toward the idea that understanding their internal consequence completes the story in a satisfying way. And while it can bring a sense of relief to recognize that what they did had depth and consequence, that relief can quietly keep your attention anchored to them. That is not where your life is meant to stay centered. Because while their internal world may carry echoes of what was lost, your reality has been moving in a different direction entirely. You have been doing something far more difficult than avoidance. You have been staying with experience instead of escaping it, feeling what needed to be felt instead of bypassing it, allowing clarity to form instead of defending against it. That process is not passive. It is formative. It reshapes a person from the inside out. And through that process, something important has emerged in you, not as a reaction to them, but as a result of what you moved through, a clearer sense of self-respect, emotional precision, and an understanding of what kind of love is aligned with your depth. That is not compensation, it is development. The avoidant did not fully understand what they were stepping away from at the time they made those choices. Their perception was filtered through their own protective structure, which reduced emotional stakes in order to make distance feel manageable. But the consequence of those choices is now part of their internal history in a way that cannot be completely undone. And still, even that is not the central point, because the most important outcome of all of this is not what they now understand or carry. It is what you now carry. You were placed in a situation where your capacity to love deeply was not matched with the same consistency in return. And instead of allowing that experience to harden you into something smaller, you moved through it in a way that preserved your depth rather than reducing it. You learned through experience what alignment feels like and what misalignment costs. The avoidant lost access to something they did not fully recognize in time. but you did not lose yourself in the process of being seen incompletely. What you gained, clarity, self-respect, emotional grounding, does not depend on their recognition, their regret, or their understanding. It stands on its own, and in the end, that is the only outcome that continues to matter long after the story between two people has already ended. In the end, what happened with the avoidant is not the center of your story anymore. Their realization, their regret, or their internal consequence may exist, but it no longer defines you or your direction. What truly remains is what you became through it all, clearer, stronger in self-respect, and more aware of the kind of love that aligns with your depth. You didn't lose yourself in what they couldn't sustain. You found yourself more fully within it, and that is the only ending that actually continues to matter.